Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6. This week, we'll be completing our discussion of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and we'll also be examining Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor. And it's my hope that we'll use this philosophical work as a lens through which to explore Austen and then also other works later in the course. So, in this lecture, I want to give you a little bit of background information on Susan Sontag. And I should probably warn you up front that you may notice me looking off to the side several times. It's not because I'm trying to be suspicious. My lecture notes are actually on my computer to my right-hand side. All right, so let's get started with our discussion of Susan Sontag. First of all, who is Susan Sontag? She is a larger-than-life, incredibly famous public intellectual who just wrote prolific and incredibly diverse works of literature and other kinds of writing. Her works include things like novels, short stories, cultural criticism, films, and also plays. And I want to show you on this slide just a sense of just the variety of her work. This is only a small sampling of the titles that she wrote. But you can get a sense of just kind of how diverse her writing is. Our particular work that we're going to be looking at is Illness as Metaphor. So Illness as Metaphor was published in 1978, and this work is really informed by her struggle at that point with metastatic breast cancer. Now, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. It appears that she did recover from it, because that was in 1978. She actually passed away at the age of 71 in 2004 of leukemia. So let's think a little bit about Illness as Metaphor in relationship to basically Sontag's entire corpus of work, what we call her oeuvre. Sontag's work is really concerned with finding a balance between moral issues and aesthetics, that is, between moral issues and then the arts. And so we can see that this becomes a central consideration of Illness as Metaphor. And I want to show you a quote that I found on almost the first page. She says, "My subject is not physical illness itself, but the uses of illness as a figure or metaphor. My point is that illness is not a metaphor, and that the most truthful way of regarding illness is one of the most purified of and most resistant to metaphoric thinking." So basically, what she argues in this work is that certain illnesses acquire a metaphoric significance that really has very little to do with the realities of the illness. By this, I mean that writers and other types of artists use certain illnesses in their work in order to make statements about either a specific character or about society as a whole. In other words, they aestheticize the illness, even though the way that they aestheticize it has almost nothing to do with the realities of that illness and the kinds of symptoms that people are who have that illness will suffer. The problem of doing this that Sontag really explores is that that metaphor that writers create about specific illness ends up bleeding into our cultural consciousness. And by this, I mean that as a culture, we begin to perceive certain illnesses as having certain sort of moral or characteristic qualities that really don't have anything to do with their reality. Now, she talks about two illnesses in particular in order to explore this idea of metaphorization. The first one that she spends the most amount of time on is tuberculosis, and the second one is cancer. She talks about a couple of other illnesses, in particular venereal disease like syphilis, and she also talks about bubonic plague, but those are really only discussed in passing and in comparison to tuberculosis and also cancer. So I want to focus on tuberculosis because I think that that illness and its metaphoric uses are most pertinent to our discussion of Austen. So here's some background on tuberculosis. Historically, tuberculosis was called consumption, And it was called this because it was perceived that the illness was sort of consuming the individual. Now, people obviously historically really didn't understand the etiology of tuberculosis, or what was causing it, or honestly how to stop it. So here's what we now know in terms of modern science. Tuberculosis is a contagious infection that starts in the lungs and that can spread to other parts of the body. Its symptoms include things like fevers, fatigue, loss of appetite, chest pains, and what we see most often in literature, which is coughing up either mucus or at later stages blood. Now, tuberculosis is a bacterial infection. It's treated with antibiotics. But before it was treated with antibiotics, now I should say too, it's also can be cured with antibiotics. But antibiotics are a modern invention. So prior to the invention of antibiotics to treat tuberculosis, tuberculosis was an incurable and terminal disease. So what Sontag points out is that the symptoms of tuberculosis end up becoming used by writers to indicate certain qualities in their characters. Now, she goes through and traces a number of ways in which tuberculosis becomes used as a metaphor. Some of them are really contradictory, but she traces out the contradictions in order to show you the various ways in which writers, in particular writers from, I would say, about the Renaissance through the early 20th century, wrote about tuberculosis and thought about tuberculosis as well. So here's first and foremost, she argues that unlike plague, or unlike something like cholera, tuberculosis is not an epidemic. And so it gets used as a metaphor to talk about the individual. So we're not going to see tuberculosis really used on a kind of social wide level the way that we did in Journal of the Plague Year or Boccaccio's Decameron when they describe the plague. Secondly, she points out that in some cases, tuberculosis, or what we oftentimes associate, and it was associated in the 18th and 19th century with poverty. Tuberculosis was considered a disease that largely affected sort of poor people, although we know that that's not really the case historically. But nonetheless, tuberculosis often gets deployed in literature that's talking about poor people. And it oftentimes is used to characterize orphans, young waifish widows, prostitutes, those kinds of characters. So an example, if you've ever seen Les Mis, is that Fantine, the mother of Cosette, is supposed to die of tuberculosis, and she is a young single mother who's just sort of continuously victimized by society. So the next and I think more prominent association that we see in literature is one that she argues starts around the same period as when Austen's Persuasion comes out, and that is the kind of romanticizing of tuberculosis. In particularly, she argues that tuberculosis gets deployed by writers in order to indicate characters that have great passion. And she means that in a couple of ways. In particular, she talks about that characters who have tuberculosis in literature oftentimes are just sort of passionate in general, but their passion is blighted. So, for example, she argues that it's used to indicate characters who are just sort of discontented with the world and with the world as it's developed. But more often than not, we see it used to discuss and describe characters who have been in love or who are in love and whose love is, in some sense, blighted, or they're not allowed to see that through. So tuberculosis, she argues, becomes used to characterize different characters who have incredibly romantic, idealized personalities. And as a result, it can indicate characters who have a kind of angelic nature. And I think that as she argues, this has something to do with the fact that the individual who has tuberculosis is seen as kind of like wasting away, almost as though they're not really meant for this earth. or that it even becomes kind of aestheticized and also eroticized. So what she's pointing out is that tuberculosis is used in literature to indicate characters who are really vulnerable, who have rosy cheeks, which could be seen as a sign of passion, but she's pointing out is usually a sign of fever. And in this case, you should think about maybe the idea of like women like fainting onto fainting couches. That idea that that woman is both romantic and she's also kind of an erotic object. So I want to read to you another quote from Sontag that I think is really telling. She writes, "One might reasonably suppose that this romanticization of TB was a merely literary transfiguration of the disease, and that the era of its great trepidations, TB was probably thought to be disgusting, as cancer is now. Surely everyone in the 19th century knew about, for example, the stench of the breath of the consumptive person. Yet all the evidence indicates that the cult of TB was not simply an invention of romantic poets and opera librettists, but a widespread attitude, and that the person dying young of TB really was perceived as a romantic personality." So I'll give you an example of I think the kind of literary character that she's talking about. This is a screenshot from Moulin Rouge, which was a movie that came out in 2001. And it's showing actually Nicole Kidman's character, who is a young courtesan, dying of tuberculosis in the arms of her lover, but only after her vulnerability and her true nature is discovered, and also only after their passion for one another is blighted by the fact that her manager wants her to have a relationship with someone who's far more wealthy than this young poet that she's fallen in love with. So I think that what Sontag's point is in the quote that I just mentioned is that we know that historically diseases like tuberculosis, and that we know that all diseases actually carry with them certain symptoms that are really unpleasant, right? And that she says are kind of gross. Like, and she gives the example of someone with consumption having bad breath. There's also obviously the issue of them being feverish, the issue of them coughing up blood. But she's pointing out that you would think that historically people would be aware of these realities, and they certainly were, but that nonetheless, despite those realities, culture comes to believe TB to be associated with ideas about romantic personalities, romance, vulnerability, passion. And so by doing this, what happens is that culturally, TB becomes kind of sanitized in a way, in a certain sense, that it's no longer seen as being associated with the kind of gross elements of it, but is seen as being an index to someone's moral worth. So in the case of this picture that I'm giving you, the ultimate moral worth of this courtesan is somebody who is both capable of love and someone who is very beloved. And what's interesting is that she points out too that certain diseases, not all diseases are used in this way. So what she's pointing out is there's kind of a sliding scale with the way in which diseases get aestheticized. So first, we know that only certain diseases are aestheticized. Diseases like TB, right? As she says, like syphilis, like cholera, and like cancer. And only certain diseases get sanitized within literature and within wider culture as well. So her point is that something like TB, which is, a really devastating illness, that devastation gets sort of erased or gets sanitized, so that what we're really seeing is sort of, this angelic picture of suffering, or this angelic and highly romantic picture that just doesn't really have very much to do with reality. But we don't see this in other illnesses. So for example, this character would never, this character, the young courtesan, there's a reason why she's dying of TB versus syphilis or like colorectal cancer. And Sontag's point is that a disease like syphilis might be used to pass a moral judgment upon the character or upon society in a way that TB doesn't. And that something like colorectal cancer is just not something we're going to see in literature, I think maybe because it doesn't lend itself as well to that kind of sanitizing and that kind of aestheticizing. So I want to leave you with one last quote from Sontag. And it's really kind of her discussion of why we do this. She says here, and also her discussion of kind of the fact that the way in which we metaphorize certain diseases, those diseases change over time. So she says, it's still difficult to imagine how the reality of such a dreadful disease could be transformed so preposterously. It may help us to consider our own era's comparable act of distortion, under the pressure of the need to express romantic attitudes about the self. The object of distortion is not, of course, cancer, a disease that no one's managed to glamorize. In the 20th century, the repellent, harrowing disease that has made the index of a superior sensitivity, the vehicle of a spiritual feeling and a critical discontent, is insanity. So I want to leave you with that quote in order to think about the idea that certain diseases can be used as metaphors. Those diseases change over time, and that those diseases, because they are metaphorized and used figuratively by authors, then come to become a part of our cultural fabric. So then they enter into the way in which we think about the disease, we think about people who have the disease, and we think about the way in which that disease then can be used to make a kind of comment on society. So in Austen, no one actually dies of TB, at least not in Persuasion. So for us, I want us to think about not really the specifics of how Sontag is talking about the TB, but rather the way in which a disease or a medical problem can get used as a metaphor or a figure in order to talk about something going on in the text, in particular character. So what I want us to think about is in what way do the illnesses that various characters have in Persuasion, in what way do those serve as a kind of index into their moral worthiness? And then similarly, are there any characters in Austen's Persuasion that, though they don't explicitly have TB, would fit into this kind of character type of someone that has a kind of romanticized and consumptive illness? All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.